Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Welcome back to my kitchen. Since my last chocolate dessert cup video was such a success on both Facebook and YouTube, I decided to do another one for you today. That last cup was actually a simple cylinder that was stenciled, so it was dark chocolate with gold on top, edible gold luster. I'm going to do something similar, the similar stenciling effect, but we're going to take it into a very, very different form using spherical shapes and an assortment of different molds. So this cup will actually be standing on its own little pedestal, as you see here, and it's going to have its very own lid that we'll place on it at the end. All chocolate or modeling chocolate. So let's talk about what you'll need for this project. Basically, it's a one ingredient project, or two ingredients. I've got chocolate. We'll use a little bit of modeling chocolate later. The chocolate will be melted to form all the spherical and molded pieces. We'll be using the modeling chocolate to trim it out with some basic ribbon work. You'll also need an assortment of molds. We're going to be using a 3-inch diameter mold, and I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. We're also going to be using a sort of flat-topped hemisphere mold, which will form an inner disc or a riser in the pedestal of the cup. Optionally, I've got a smaller hemisphere mold. This is about 1.5 inches to elevate the cup even further. I'll be showing some pictures of a cup that is sitting on another dome. For the base itself, for the little foot that it sits on, I've used something rather makeshift. I didn't have a silicone piece of this size, so this is just a cut down paper cup, which is about 2.5 inches in diameter, just the right size, and I've got them in varying sizes so I can do even broader bases if I'd like, and I think you'll see some pictures of those. And then lastly, I have some silicone molds. These are typically used for shaping fondant, but I'm going to use them for making the handles on top, and again, we're going to be putting chocolate in them. To stencil the chocolate, once we've got it set and molded and chilled, I do that with frosting sheets. It's an edible paper, but we're not going to be putting it actually on the chocolate and leaving it there. We're going to be just using it as a stencil and removing it later, and we'll be cutting it into fun shapes with craft paper punches. I'm going to start first by melting my chocolate. I do that in a double boiler over very low heat. You don't want to get it too hot or it will seize and become very thick. I have a whole nother video about how to melt chocolate in a double boiler, so I recommend you jump on over there if you want more details. Okay, my chocolate's melted. A word about the chocolate, because this is a freestanding chocolate project that stands on its own with not next to anything cold, like my chocolate cake wraps, for instance. You want to make sure you're using a tempered real chocolate. Tempered real chocolate will stay firm at room temperature and it'll set very crisp, hard, and shiny. Or you want to use a compound chocolate, which is not real chocolate. Compound chocolate differs from real chocolate in that the cocoa butter in real chocolate has been replaced with palm oils. But the benefit of working with a compound chocolate is it doesn't require tempering. You simply need to melt it, then you can coat it or do whatever you want it to do, and then let it set up, and it will then set up firm and hard, much like tempered real chocolate. Tempering of real chocolate is a somewhat complex process of working the chocolate and bringing it up and down through different temperature ranges so it sets up firmly. If you were just to melt real chocolate and not temper it, it would set up, but it'd be kind of soft and more prone to wilting at room temperature. So again, work with a real tempered chocolate or work with a compound, sometimes called a coating or summer chocolate, that has palm oil in it and sets up nice and crisply at room temperature. I'm actually working with a compound chocolate to skip the tempering process today. And I've melted it just as I would real chocolate over a double boiler over low heat. You can see I've just got a little bowl sitting over some steaming water. I don't want to get it too hot or it will get too thick, but it's flowing nice and smoothly now. And this is what I'm kind of looking for it to kind of drain smoothly off the spoon and not to have any lumps in it. I've got a few here, but I think I can press them out. Okay, we're going to start by molding the dome for the lid and the dome for the base with my 3-inch silicone mold. Some people will brush the chocolate into the mold, but I don't like to use a brush because once the chocolate sets in the brush, it's really hard to clean. I find it's much easier to kind of spoon it in and spread it around. First things first, though, is make sure the mold's completely clean. No lint on it, no fingerprints, because that will actually transfer into the chocolate. And you want a nice, beautiful, crisp, shiny looking chocolate. So I'm just spooning a little bit in, and I am going to work it around with the back side of my teaspoon so it comes up to the edge all the way around. Actually, it's going to go over the edge a little bit because we're going to clean that edge with a spatula. I just do want to make sure the sides are evenly coated, and I'm going to tilt it around like so a little bit to ensure that it's nicely coated on the sides. And then I'm going to dump it completely upside down and drain out a lot of the excess chocolate. Again, this will make for a thinner cup. Now I've got a lot of mess on top, which we don't want, or we'll have a really uneven edge when it comes out of the mold. So I'm going to take my spatula and just scrape that down a few times so it's nice and even. So I'll just do one more quickly to show you how easy the process is. I think I had a little too much chocolate in that one, so it's puddling towards the bottom, and I want to minimize the puddling as much as possible because we don't want a lot of chocolate at the base of this either. Now this coating chocolate will set at room temperature, a cool room temperature, pretty quickly. I don't need to refrigerate it, but I probably will accelerate the process in the fridge just because we're on video time and I want to be able to pop these out more quickly. Now I've got some other molds to fill for the base, this one, for the riser, this one, and for the handles. And for that, they're much smaller spaces, so I'm going to turn to my parchment cone to get the chocolate in there. It's the same melted chocolate, but I just am going to use this as a funnel more or less so I can get it in that mold a lot more neatly. This is for the base of the chocolate, actually. This is for the bottom. I like to pipe in concentric circles if I can. This will just get the chocolate in there a little bit more evenly. This is the same process I used to create the base for my leaf cups, which I did recently. If you haven't seen that video, I encourage you to check it out. And you just want to shake it and make sure it's completely even. It's more important for this piece to be level because it will be seen. Now for a typical handle, I would just pipe it very carefully, maybe even with a smaller tip, smaller opening than the one I've got on this cone. Mine is kind of big here because I don't want it to overflow the top of the mold at all. I want it to be exactly flush to the surface, but still getting into all these small spots. And if you've missed any small corners, you can take your trussing needle or scribe tool and just a clean one and just knock the chocolate into the corners. I think I missed a little corner down here as well. My goal is not to overflow the mold because I want to be able to pop it out and have a nice clean edge on it. Now this piece is the flat topped hemisphere, which I use just to elevate the cup a little bit. And I also pipe that in. I'm not going to fill this up all the way. I'm going to fill it up maybe about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit less. We don't need so many of these, but this is the idea. And again, you want these to be pretty level, so I'm going to give this a good shake, and I tend to pipe these in concentric circles as well, so that I'm sure to get one layer of chocolate down. Now I'm going to accelerate the chilling process, as I said, by sticking these in the freezer for just a few minutes, and then we'll pop them out. So to unmold, I'm simply going to invert them. You can invert them onto a larger sheet tray. I'm just going to invert them onto my cake cardboards I've got here. And look how beautiful and super shiny they are. And had I just used real chocolate and not tempered it, they'd pop out like this if I chilled them, but they wouldn't be super shiny like this. So using a tempered chocolate or a compound chocolate is going to ensure that they set nice and shiny like so. Now for the cups, you will always get a slightly ragged edge. We're going to trim that out with a little bit of modeling chocolate. Even though I wiped it with a spatula, there's always a little bit of raggedness to it. This one's more ragged than usual. And you have to be a little bit careful here. I just like to peel these back gradually until the chocolate pops out on its own. And I take care to hold it from the bottom and not from the top because I don't want to leave fingerprints on it. Now, because this is a compound chocolate, this will store at a cool room temperature, and they'll stay rigid and firm quite nicely. I just need to put them in airtight containers because I don't want anything falling on them, but you don't necessarily need to refrigerate them. In fact, I typically don't. Same process for the handle. I'm just really pushing back on the mold, not tugging on the chocolate, but pushing back on the mold. And then for the paper cup, just popping it out like so. And this will become the base. So we are ready to lay these patterns onto the cups. The stripes and the little loopy patterns you see on top were all stenciled on. And for that, I work with frosting sheets as stencils because they're frosting sheets in edible paper, but it's very malleable and conformable. if you were to use plastic or acetate, it wouldn't stick and shape to the top of the chocolate surface, and we need it to do that. So I'm going to start first by just laying on the stencils on the really simple pieces. For the base, I'm just going to put this little daisy down. And because we're going to be using a luster spray to spray the gold. It's actually a bronze spray, not gold. It looks gold on the chocolate. And it comes out with some force, so you don't want your stencils to blow off. So I am going to stick them down with a touch, just a touch of corn syrup, generally in a spot that I know is going to be covered later. So here I'm just applying a little bit to the middle because I know my cup's going to be sitting on the middle. And then I just make sure that every other piece is down nice and flush and flat. And just so you get an idea of how I cut these shapes, I often use craft paper punches. I love to use crafting tools in decorating because they create surprising effects that you might not have gotten if you just stuck with conventional baking and decorating tools. I'm going to use a smaller daisy though for this little riser piece. We're going to leave one riser. Actually, I use 2 risers per cup, and I'm going to leave one completely unsprayed because they're nice and shiny and they're really pretty that way as well. Now I'm going to center this on here as well. And in this case, I want to make sure I really press down the edges of the petals so that they're down against the sides of the disc because it drops off. And if I don't do that, then the spray will get under them. So to stencil the top, I would just stick this down. And then I'll proceed to show you what additional pieces I add to create the stencil for the bottom part. So I've just tacked it with a little bit of corn syrup in the center, and you'll notice it's still lifting on the edges, which is not ideal. Those are areas that spray will get underneath. But I am going to be laying these little stripes down the sides, so I'm hopeful that when I stick them down, I'll be able to flatten it out. We'll see. But to do that, I am going to elevate this because it'll be easier to get my stencil all the way down the side if that's not on the cardboard. And I'm cutting these strips. These I cut nice and straight with my paper cutter earlier. So they're all roughly the same thickness. And I'm just going to anchor one in each corner here. And you'll notice I'm applying the corn syrup to the paper, not the chocolate, because if you get the corn syrup on the chocolate, it'll leave a shiny spot. So when possible, I will apply the corn syrup to the paper when I'm doing a stenciled pattern. I will need to apply a little bit down at the bottom to hold it tight there. And I'm going to proceed all the way around with this particular stencil doing that way. And then just a touch of corn syrup at the bottom to anchor it at the bottom. So you'll notice as I'm applying this second set of stripes in between the first set that I put down, that it's helping to push down this piece of the loopy pattern that's sticking up. And that's a good thing because that'll mean I'll get a much cleaner stencil. The more flat everything lays, the better. So the last step is just, making sure I'm pressing it down at the top, all around the top, and all around the bottom, looking at it from all directions to make sure that that stencil is lying flat against the chocolate, which it is. Some little edges of the chocolate have knocked off on the bottom. That's fine because we're going to trim it out later. And I think that's looking good. So now I'm ready to kind of tidy up this area, set up my spray backdrop, and we'll get spraying. So I'm ready to spray. I usually do this under a ventilated hood in my work kitchen, which is in the basement, because the sprays, these edible luster sprays, do go everywhere. You can also use an airbrush for this, which is a little more controlled, but I tend to prefer the sprays simply because a lot of color goes down very quickly. With an airbrush, I need to spend more time spraying. I'm using PME bronze spray. It's going to look gold against the dark chocolate. It's exactly that color there. I love it. Just give it a good shake before you start. And a test spray on your surface. And then I like to use slow motions at a distance, circular motions, just to make sure I don't get too much spray in any one spot. I've got it elevated so I can get around the bottom easily. And I do like to do this pretty quickly because the paper will start to lift as the spray sits on it. And I can see it lifting in some spots, so I'm just going to give it a couple more spritzes, and then we'll set it aside, let it dry just a touch, maybe a minute or two, just long enough for me to spray the other pieces, and then we'll remove the stencils. So just because I'm getting the top, I'm just focusing on the top here. I want the edge to stay dark brown, so that's why I didn't elevate that piece. But this one I want to get the entire edge. And again, it's much easier for me to do it if I can get a little bit underneath it. Not exactly underneath it, but from the side. And then obviously easier for me to rotate it if it's up on something. Flipping it over into a clean area. When I'm spraying flat on something like this, I do tend to like to use paper towel because it absorbs the spray. There's less pooling that happens like so. And you don't want to handle it while the spray is still wet, or even after it's dried because it can rub off. We'll be really careful about handling those stenciled areas. Okay, we're ready to remove the stencil. I, again, like to do that as soon as possible after laying the stencil and after spraying, because if the corn syrup sets, it can make it more difficult for it to come off. And also on humid days, the frosting sheets get a little tacky and they too can also stick. So I'm just going to be pulling it off carefully. If I need to steady it, I'm holding it from the top here. I'm still holding the paper. And ta-da. Beautiful, nicely stenciled bottom. This is going to be the bottom. You could also make this the top, but I'm going to use it for the bottom. And now let's remove the other stencils quickly. That one's done. I often use my trussing needle just to get an edge and also to steady it as I lift it off. And that looks beautiful. That'll just be the base, the pedestal. And for this piece, and my fingers are really big, so to steady it, to lift it off, I'm steadying with this trussing needle as I lift with the other one. Because if I were to put a finger on it, I would most certainly smudge it, and I'm trying not to do that. There we go. And that will be the little top decorative piece on the cup. Okay, the next step is trimming out both the bottom of the lid and the top edge of the cup, because as I said, when you unmold it, it always roughens up a little bit. Now I've got one. This is going to be the lid for this particular cup. I've already trimmed it out. I just stenciled it, as you can see, with just that simple loopy pattern without all the stripes. I just wanted to have a simpler lid because the base is so busy. And I trimmed it out with a little bit of modeling chocolate. I used about a ½ inch band on the top. I'm going to use a thinner band on the bottom here so they just have not so much dark chocolate in the middle when we put it together. Now I have a whole nother video about how to make chocolate ribbon, so I refer you off to that for details. I have a whole nother video also, a lot of videos these days, about how to make modeling chocolate. And that's what I'm working with here. I made this actually probably 2 weeks ago. It stores quite a long time. And I'm just gonna shape it into the general direction I want it to go. And I find I get the nicest, most even rolls if rather than rolling it with a rolling pin, I actually roll it through my pasta machine. I'm going to start it on the number 1 setting, which is the most open setting, and I'm going to gradually work it down to the number 3 setting because I want it a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner rather than that. Still a little too chunky. So I'm now going to advance it safely to 3. If I were to just try to jam it through on the number 3 setting, I'd probably end up tearing the chocolate, so I do like to do it gradually. And normally I would have my pasta machine clamped down, but there really isn't a place to clamp it to here today. So this side of the ribbon looks a little bit smoother, so I'm going to work with that. For the bottom of the cup, I think I cut my ribbon about 1/4 inch. We're just going to eyeball it. So I just start by first getting a straight edge, and again, my ribbon video goes into this in great detail. Now for the stitched piece, I like to leave everything intact and not move it because then I am ensured of a pretty straight edge. If things shift, then you have to realign them against your straight edge. I'm going to take another crafting tool. It's actually a sewing tool. I'm using that to emboss this stitching mark, just running it up against the side of my straight edge so it's straight, but not pressing so hard that it goes all the way through. And that's what I use to create the nice stitched mark. Then I simply advance my ruler about 1/2 inch. Did a nice cut, and I have gentle pressure on the ruler so that the chocolate doesn't slip underneath. And I've got this nice ribbon. This would be my fat ribbon that I used for the lid. We're going to use a thinner piece, as I said, slightly thinner piece for the top. And because that moved a lot on me, I'm just going to make sure that that straight edge is indeed straight and flush against the ruler, because otherwise I'll have an unstraight cut when I advance it. I'm going to advance it about a little bit more than 1/4 inch. And again, applying gentle pressure here, moving my fingers, continuing to apply gentle pressure all the way down the length of the ruler. If I don't, the chocolate will slide underneath and I'll get an uneven cut. Okay, we're in the final leg of the assembly process, just applying chocolate ribbons, and then we'll put it all together. I've got my lid part all trimmed out and complete. Just going to finish trimming the base. Here's that ribbon I just cut. Now, I always like to start by choosing a front. The front would be what I'm looking at, and that's the angle that's most symmetrical from my point of view. There's a little bit of edge of chocolate sticking out here, so that'll likely be my back. I'm going to start by putting the ribbon on the front, and the seam will close out at the back. And to tack down anything that's thin, like a ribbon, a modeling chocolate ribbon or a fondant ribbon, I like to use a little smear of corn syrup. Glucose can also work. I tend to avoid things like royal icing, thick royal icing, because it would just, A, I don't need to mix it for this project, but B, it would be a lot more lumpy and the ribbon wouldn't lie flat. So just got enough to make it tacky. We don't run it super wet. And I'm just applying a little more corn syrup as I work my way around. I don't apply it all at once because sometimes I can get the ribbon stuck to itself. So I'd like to apply the corn syrup gradually. And the seam will end right about here, I think. This is probably about the back, so I've got plenty of ribbons, so I'm going to cut off the extra here. I like to end, if I can, in the middle of a brown stripe, because then the seam is going to be less obvious. And to steady this, I'm holding just from the top with my finger. It's going to leave a little bit of a fingerprint, but that area is not going to show because it's going to be the bottom. And I just want to cut it where they intersect. A little bit of smaller scissors would come in handy here. And they're a little bit clunky, but they do the job. I'm going to set that aside as we assemble the base of the cup, just to allow that a little more drying time. So I'm just going to put my lid together, and I'm just trying to replicate the one that's in front of me. It's got a little bit of height, and then it's got this spacer, and then it's got a little chocolate ball, and then the leafy handle on top. And to create the initial separation, I've just taken a little bit of my modeling chocolate. I'm going to create a tiny little ball. You don't need to do this. I find sticking it together, though, with a little bit of modeling chocolate and the melted chocolate, that extra modeling chocolate just tends to make a little something to sink into. So it's helpful to have that. So I've got a little bit of regular melted chocolate. Once that sets, it's going to hold this little chocolate ball in place perfectly. And my back here is here because I've got a seam there, so I'm decorating towards me. The next thing I want to do then is place this little riser there. Now, picking this up is challenging because about anywhere I touch it, I'm going to leave a fingerprint. So I take my trussing needle typically and just pierce it so that I can pick it up. And then a little bit of chocolate acting as my glue. And then I'm going to place it on the center. This sets pretty quickly. I'm going to push it in a little bit more. It sets pretty quickly, the chocolate, so you want to move pretty fast to make sure everything's centered front and back. And now the challenge is getting the needle out. I used my other trussing needle to hold this down as I lifted that out. I'm making another little ball here. Nothing too big because I do want to see the little daisy pattern that I stenciled, and when I press the leaf into this, it's going to spread a little bit. Now I'm going to, holding this one by the sides, and again it's facing towards me. I'm just going to get this roughly placed where I want it without gluing it with the chocolate first. Now I've applied chocolate, that'll be the ultimate glue, trying not to handle the leaf from the top. And I'll just hold this there until it sets in place. So that completes the lid. I think that looks pretty good. I still have some time to finesse this, so I'm going to move it a little bit to the side. And then I'd give that about 5–10 minutes and be completely set. Okay, for the bottom, I've got my simple base here, and I've got some pictures of some ones where I did much broader bases that have much more stenciling going on. So you can get really creative with your pieces. They don't all have to look like mine. I'm going to put this little chocolate riser in the center because I like the shininess of it. It does cover a lot of the stencil. That's the only downside. And just let that set, again using chocolate as the glue here. And I do like to choose a front. This base is a little bit lopsided. It's lower here and higher in the back, and there's a little chip in the back side. So I'm going to put the front facing side toward me. And then I am going to use another little ball. Sometimes I cut a disc with the top of my, this is a coupler from a pastry bag. I can cut a little disc and put it there. But I'm just going to try to use a little ball and see if that secures the base nicely to it. Try to use as little chocolate dough here as possible so it's not too visible. But it just gives a little nesting place for that cup to get pushed into. And looking overhead to make sure everything's centered. Now when I pick up this piece, I want to do so carefully because I just put the ribbon down, and so the ribbon's still a little soft. If I were to give it a little more drying time, the ribbon would be less likely to misshape. I'm picking it up probably sooner than I normally would. And just holding it from the underside. Before I put it on here, though, I want to get chocolate here to secure it. And make sure my seam is facing back, which it is. And then try to get it centered as well as I can, front to back and side to side before I push down on the chocolate dough. I think that looks pretty centered and pretty straight. And so again, I'd give that 5–10 minutes or more of setting time before I were to put the lid on and present it. Okay, we're ready to serve this up. I've got my base on a nice little plate. And again, if you're presenting these and moving these around, it's best to put them on a stable support because while they are something you can lift up from the base or the bottom here, they are still somewhat fragile. I'm just going to do it really simply today and load this with some fresh berries. You could put a pudding or a mousse in here, a little mini cupcake, another truffle. Any number of edible surprises could go in here and look beautiful. I'm thinking a little bit of gold luster dust sprinkled on top of these berries would be superb, but I didn't have the foresight to bring that with me on set today, so I am just going to put a little sprig of mint, tuck it in there, and you could present it without the lid if you wanted, if you didn't want to go to the lengths of making the lid, but I like the concept of having it completely lidded off. It just looks really regal and elegant, and then when guests get it, they can lift it off and be surprised by what they find inside. So if this cup seems a little too intimidating, no worries. Remember, I started this whole process with a chocolate cylinder that was stenciled in the same fashion. And that's just a one-step process of spreading chocolate. So if you haven't seen that video, please do check it out. And until next video, live sweetly.